History repeating on Hillsborough College's Hawk Radio, live from Ybor City. We're sorry about that. We were having a little bit of technical difficulties. Hopefully our listeners can hear us now. We're back and we're talking about the rise of the AIDS epidemic. It began in 1968 when a black teenager by the name of Robert Rayford admitted himself to St. Louis City Hospital. Is it St. Louis or St. Louis? St. Louis. I don't know why that
I have confirmation. We are live. Sorry.
St. Louis City Hospital with untraceable symptoms, including swelling of the legs and lower body.
I believe it's St. Louis. Sorry.
Shortness of breath. Reaction. And an extremely low white blood cell count, meaning his immune system was not responding as it should. He had been experiencing these symptoms as early as 1966, and he passed away in 1969. It wasn't until 1987 that researchers pinpointed the disease as the HIV virus. This was the first, and as we know of retroactively, documented AIDS case. The epidemic reported to have started in the mid to late 1970s. According to NYC AIDS Memorial website, in this period, between 100,000 and 300,000 people could have already become HIV positive. So what is HIV/AIDS? According to the World Health Organization, HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus, is a virus that attacks the body's immune system. Now, there are many different immunodeficient viruses. One of them I have, lupus, but this is a much, much deadlier form and a much, much more extreme virus. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or commonly known as AIDS, occurs at the highest stage of HIV. According to the World Health Organization, HIV is spread from bodily fluids of an infected person, including blood, breast milk, semen, and vaginal fluids. It is not spread by kisses, hugs, or sharing food. It can also spread from a mother to her baby.
Interesting.
On May 18, 1981, journalist Lawrence Mass wrote the first article on AIDS for the New York Native, a gay newspaper in New York City. According to the article, a gay tipster overheard his physician mention that some gay men were being treated in ICU units in New York City for a strange pneumonia. Disease rumors largely unfounded was the headline of Mass's article. Mass repeated a New York City public health official's claims that there was no wave of disease sweeping through the gay community. At this point, however, the Centers for Disease Control have been gathering information for about a month on the outbreak that Mass's source dismissed. As news spread, large news sources began to refer to the disease with the term gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID, as well as the term gay cancer, suggesting an unfounded link between homosexuality and the new disease. By 1982, over 270 deaths had been reported. The Center for Disease Control establishes the term acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, and identifies 4 risk factors: male homosexuality, intravenous drug use, Haitian origin, and hemophilia A.
Haitian as in the country?
Yeah. I wasn't able to find more on that, or why they link it to that.
Interesting little wrench to throw in there.
Yeah. In 1983, the AIDS Medical Foundation, or AMF, is founded by several doctors as an organization dedicated to researching and potentially curing AIDS in New York City. In this year, potential blood donor contamination was identified by the CDC, and fear began to spread and sweep the nation. Homosexual men were thus barred from donating blood, even if they had tested negative for HIV or AIDS. Several health organizations issued the first recommendations for preventing sexual, drug-related, and occupational transmission of HIV. By the end of 1983, 33 countries had reported HIV/AIDS cases, and over 2,000 deaths had been reported. And I believe in my notes I mentioned this later on, but the bar on homosexual men from donating blood was not lifted until very recently. I believe 2023 was when that formally was lifted. Was it one of those rules that was just like not enforced after a while? Yeah, that's essentially what it was, and a lot of organizations did allow gay men to donate blood, but at the federal level, it had not been formally lifted until 2023. That's weird. That's really weird. And despite that, there is some new legislation that does discriminate against those with HIV/AIDS in current day, and we're going to get to that. In 1984, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Margaret Heckler announces that Dr. Robert Gallo and his colleagues at the National Cancer Institute have found the cause of AIDS, a retrovirus that they have labeled HTLV-3. Heckler also announces the development of a diagnostic blood test to identify HTLV-3 and expresses hope that a vaccine against AIDS will be produced within 2 years. That's according to the NYC AIDS Memorial Timeline.
Hopes. A little behind on that.
Yeah.
That deadline.
And we're formally maybe 5 years into the defined epidemic?
Yeah, but been around since the 60s. Which is crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was that old. I thought it started in the 70s.
No, from when I was doing my research on this, there was a lot of articles that defined it as a man in the 70s who came forth, and that is when they identified the disease as HIV/AIDS and reported it as the first case. But then they retroactively traced it back to this man in the 1960s who died in 1969. So this disease had been around for a while. I don't know if the Haitian origin is linked to the teenager himself, since he was patient zero. But I guess that means it originated in Haiti?
I don't know.
I don't think that's something they can trace, but
I have no idea why they put that there. But
here's the big one. 1985. The U.S. Department of Defense began screening all recruits for HIV and rejected those who tested positive. Ronald Reagan, for the first time 4 years into his presidency, spoke on the AIDS epidemic. According to the article Silence from the Great Communicator, the Early Years of the AIDS Epidemic under the Reagan Administration by Jacqueline A. Ortiz of Vanderbilt University, and this is a quote from her article, so forgive me, this is going to be a bit long. By 1985, the American public and federal government finally paid attention to AIDS, but it was too late. AIDS transformed into a national epidemic that flourished under the homophobia, disinterest, and defunding of the Reagan administration. Before joining the Reagan administration, White House Communications Director Pat Buchanan disparaged people with AIDS during the onset of the epidemic. Buchanan regarded the disease as moral punishment for, quote, the poor homosexuals who have declared war on nature, and now nature is exacting an awful retribution. Although Buchanan released this statement before his confirmation to the Reagan administration, his sarcastic and hateful message resonated with many conservative voters who continued their support after his confirmation. Similarly, Reagan repeatedly appealed to anti-gay constituents during his 1980 presidential campaign. Reagan severed any affinity to the gay community. Quote, the gay movement isn't just asking for civil rights. It's asking for recognition and acceptance of an alternative lifestyle, which I do not believe society can condone, nor can I. In addition to describing gay Americans as abominations, Reagan established a clear anti-gay position for his presidency. In 1984, Reagan declared that his administration would resist the efforts of some to obtain government endorsement of homosexuality. Whether these statements reflected his personal beliefs or served as political hyperbole, Reagan earned the votes and support of the religious right. The Reagan administration could not afford to lose this political base. Therefore, a silent stance on the AIDS epidemic allowed Reagan to maintain his political support by neglecting the deadly issue facing the gay community. And it was in 1985 that over 15,000 cases of AIDS alone, not just HIV, but AIDS, had been reported in the U.S., and over 12,000 had succumbed to the illness. Whew, that was a long paragraph. It was at this time, too, that HIV had almost always progressed into AIDS, which was essentially a death sentence for anyone diagnosed. And there was not enough research or information or work or treatment to prevent the death of those
Because a lot of people
who tested positive.
Didn't care to because they thought it was only affecting gay people, which even if it was, still not an excuse to just let them die. But it wasn't. It was affecting, it's a disease. It affects all people indiscriminately. But because it was early diagnosed as a gay disease, people just ignored it, and a lot of people died because of it. I remember I wasn't there, but I saw, I think it's recorded, Reagan's appointee to, I believe, the CDC was confronted about his inaction. Like, he was just asked, like, can you do more about this AIDS crisis? Can we get more funding? And everyone on the board just laughed at him. Like, just literally laughed at him because they thought it was ridiculous that anyone would ask to help AIDS out because it was like that gay disease. Who cares? It's embarrassing.
And it was long referred to as gay cancer well after AIDS had been formally defined.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of misinformation spread, particularly because the government had not put out any official information, no warnings, no preventative treatment, so misinformation kind of spread like wildfire. And that was part of the reason that there was so much discrimination against not just queer community members, but also those who tested positive with HIV. And I didn't include this in my notes, but well into the 1990s, there was a statistic that over 63% of women tested positive for HIV.
63% where?
I think in New York City.
Okay. Oh.
So reduced to that, but that is still a lot.
Yeah.
And, despite the, it wasn't typically associated with lesbianism, it was mostly focused on the gay community.
Which is an interesting thing in its own right, how in the history of homophobia and just gay people in general, that lesbians are always kind of forgotten about and treated as like
a
people,
footnote almost. Yeah.
This is a weird little tangent on its own, right? But like I believe in the Middle Ages, they knew about homosexuality and they of course condoned it. But in terms of lesbianism, the official medieval scholar stance was that it just did not exist. They're like it's impossible. Was their actual stance.
That homosexuality could exist in men, but not in women.
Yes, that was that it's a long-standing, weird psychological quirk where people just don't think that lesbians exist, and they get less coverage because of it.
Well, don't worry, it gets even worse as we go on. In 1986, according to the NYC AIDS Memorial, the U.S. Center for Disease Control reports that more people were diagnosed with AIDS in 1985 than in all earlier years combined. The 1985 figures show an 89% increase in new AIDS cases compared with 1984. Of all AIDS cases to date, as of 1986, 51% of adults and 59% of children have died. The new report shows that, on average, AIDS patients die about 15 months after the disease is diagnosed. Public health experts predict twice as many new AIDS cases in 1986. The Institute of Medicine reports findings that $2 billion is needed annually for proper AIDS research and care. And it was also at this time in West Africa, a second type of HIV is discovered, named HIV-2, reported contracted by commercial sex workers.
I didn't know there was a second one.
I'm not sure how it was mutated, but I can only imagine it's more resistant. Yeah. By 1987, over 50,000 cases of AIDS had been reported in the United States, and over 40,000 deaths had been reported, making AIDS almost a universally terminal diagnosis. A study by the Genitourinary Medicine Department of Edinburgh Royal Infirmary found that in the early 1980s, median survival for patients with the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome was only 11 months. Survival improved in the mid-1980s, reaching a median of 20 months. Giving almost 2 years to those who were diagnosed. It was also this year that the U.S. government bars HIV-positive immigrants and travelers from entering the country. Not a surprise move. The CDC also released findings and expanded their definition of AIDS to include wasting syndrome, a condition that causes significant weight loss and muscle loss and dementia, which is just utterly horrifying. On top of... I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but when a person is diagnosed with not just AIDS, but HIV as well, they have a higher risk of getting cancer. So now on top of that, you are at risk for potential muscle loss, weight loss, and dementia, which is absolutely terrifying. And despite all this, it wasn't until 1988 when Congress passed the first comprehensive legislation regarding AIDS, known as the Health Omnibus Programs Extension, or HOPE Act of 1988. It was the first move by the Reagan administration to allocate funding to AIDS research, treatment, and prevention, a move that came almost 7 years after the epidemic had been formally established and since Reagan took office in 1981. While this was a step in the right direction, it came much too late, as at this point over 80,000 cases of AIDS had been reported and 60,000 deaths had occurred in the United States. By the end of the 1980s, the death toll had spiked to over 120,000 Americans. A national commission on AIDS had been established, but no major progress had been made in AIDS research. AIDS was still considered a terminal diagnosis, and a cure was long from being discovered. In 1990, Congress passed the famous Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. This finally prevented discrimination on the basis of HIV/AIDS diagnosis, though it did not reinstate the right, as we mentioned before, for gay men to donate blood. This bar would not be lifted until the early 2020s. At this point, nearly twice as many Americans had died of AIDS-related complications as those who had died in the Vietnam-American War, not just including
Jesus
American
Christ.
soldiers, but Vietnamese people as well.
Jesus Christ.
In August, the largest HIV-specific federal grant program is enacted, known as the CARE Act of 1990, providing $220.5 million in federal funds for HIV community-based care and treatment services in its first year, which is not great considering that it was already defined that $2 billion is needed for proper AIDS research and treatment.
What year is this?
1990.
Okay, so at this point, it's
over 10 years.
At this point, the American government is still spending trillions and trillions of dollars on the Cold War every single year.
That's
but
important context.
They can't spare $2 billion for their own citizens that are dying at twice the rate than the Vietnam War, apparently.
In 1991, the CDC reports that 1 million Americans are HIV positive, and the World Health Organization estimates that there are nearly 10 million people with HIV worldwide. Into the 1990s, new anti-HIV therapies are developed, and AIDS deaths decline by 42% as of 1995. AIDS treatment and vaccination research continues to progress, but even today, a cure has not been found.
So even in that 5-year period, you can see a 42% decrease just when they start getting a little bit of more attention, a little bit more funding, and that could have happened 15 years sooner.
That's the issue, is that without the proper funding or care or attention, not even just that, but even education regarding that. This is when the American government actually started informing Americans on the disease, how it was contracted, that it was not contracted via food, saliva, kisses, hugs, anything like that.
People don't realize what the role the government really does play in a situation like this. 'Cause it seems like stopping a virus, that's just up to the scientists. It's not really Reagan's fault. They didn't do anything. What was he going to do? But the idea of a social contract between the governed and the governing is that the government will look out and protect its citizens. And when there is an epidemic that is causing that much death and destruction that's purely ignored because of prejudice, that is a gross violation of the social contract. And again, at the same time, if at the same exact time the United States government is spending trillions and trillions of dollars because of the Russians are doing their own thing over in Russia, we can't have that happen. But at home, they can't protect their own citizens. That's just a gross misappropriation of priorities.
And I also think this and COVID-19 now are great case studies for how not to approach an epidemic. And I also think that there is a lot of considering factors into why the AIDS crisis was so ignored. Obviously, the big reason being we don't want to draw attention to gay Americans, and
we just don't care about them.
And that is, I think, something that this is, again, history repeating. History you should know. You need to know this, that despite your background, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, you have a right to health care, or you should at the very least. And that's why it's important to draw attention to this.
Liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Life would include health. Here's a little radio history for you. At the time this was going on, Rush Limbaugh famous conservative radio host, he would have at this period weekly updates on the amount of like people that were dying of AIDS, and as like a sports host, he'd happily read off the amount of gay people that were dying of AIDS, and he'd have like little bells and whistles he'd play on his soundboard, and they would like cheer it on because they were just happy gay people were dying, and that's all AIDS was to them.
Yeah, and yeah, I didn't know about that, but it's just disheartening to hear again, especially knowing now, doing the amount of research I did for this show. It was. I didn't know too much about the AIDS crisis beforehand, and I'm glad I did my research on it because that is a lot of Americans that have died.
And I think it's an aspect, a lot of people, especially in America, think the government is just here to buy more guns and buy us a military, and that's all they're supposed to do, and everything else is just incidental. And there are real other things that a government can do that they've really, in 5 years, 42% of death.
Yeah, 42%
That's a lot.
decrease.
That's a lot of lives saved that they could have saved sooner, and that we can do. And that if you can have a unified administration and political legislation enforced, you can stop diseases. And we saw with COVID-19 that COVID-19 also quickly was supposed to be a unifying thing, but then became sectional and divided upon through political lines, and then COVID-19 ended up becoming endemic, and then no one could agree on anything, not even a vaccine, and now COVID-19 is endemic, and everyone just like they forgot all the AIDS people that died of AIDS, people completely forgot all the people that died of COVID, and some people deny that people even died of COVID. They're like, it was just a flu, but millions of people died, like no one, even people that lived through the 80s probably had no idea that there was an epidemic going on that was twice as deadly as the Vietnam War.
Even despite the major difference between these two epidemics is during COVID-19, you have widespread media accessibility as well as internet access and the ability to talk to anyone anywhere in the world. And despite all this information available at people's fingertips, there was still severe misinformation spreading around COVID-19.
Because there wasn't a unified force driving it, which is theoretically what a government is supposed to do. It's supposed to help us find the truth and help protect us. And because of sectionalism and division, they was not able to. And millions of people are dead, and COVID-19 is not going away ever.
Anytime soon. In 1999, I do have more. Sorry. In 1999, the World Health Organization declared HIV/AIDS the fourth biggest killer worldwide and the number one killer in all of Africa, the entire continent. Despite efforts made by advocates to progress anti-HIV discrimination, many are still subject to bans and restrictions upon testing positive. In February of 2026, just this year, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a policy allowing the U.S. military to ban new enlistment of people living with HIV, despite medical evidence showing undetectable individuals pose no transmission risk. The full story of the AIDS epidemic had to be condensed to time, but I highly recommend our listeners to check out more information regarding the AIDS crisis, which is available at nycaidsmemorial.org. That was my major source for this episode. They have a full comprehensive timeline that is up to date, available, and for free. And other sources that I used was the article Robert Rayford, America's First AIDS Victim, by the Weekly View writer Al Hunter, New York City AIDS Memorial Timeline, as I mentioned, at nycaidsmemorial.org, World Health Organization's infographic on HIV and AIDS at who.int.
That was really good.
We'll take a...
No, I think it's getting a little late.
He's got a lot to say this episode.
We have a lot to say this episode.
This isn't a particularly close topic at all, by any means.
No, but it does involve a lot of death and destruction in its own right. So yeah, how do I segue from that? We're just going to hard cut from AIDS to roll back your clocks 150 years. I'm kind of becoming a broken record here with all these Civil War or Civil War adjacent topics.
There's a lot to cover.
There is, and it's impossible not to. There's so much. There's just so much, and it's so relevant, and it's so much more relevant than the Revolutionary War even is. And if you're from the North, you don't think about the Civil War at all. We won it, and that's it. It's over. If you're from the South, it's not all they think about, but it's all that a lot of people think about. It lives, and the Civil War lives and breathes in the South. And that's true even going back 100 years, where, especially more 100 years ago, where it was well documented that if you were in the North and people talked about the Civil War, like even in 1880, they'd be like, oh, yeah, whatever. We won. It's fine. We're friends with the South again. We don't care. But if you went down to the South and you brought up the Civil War, you would be strapped down for an hour-long rambling of, oh, when the North came and they burned our land and they stripped our home of our rights, and you would be listening to them. They never let it go. The South, the Civil War was won on the battlefield, but the division and the sectionalism that it caused is still seen today in political maps and charts. If you look at any presidential map, there's still a divide between the South and the North, and that's why I think it's so important that I keep yapping about this topic. But that being said, I'm not talking about the Civil War. I'm talking about what happened just before the Civil War, something that you probably did hear in high school.
I was going to say Bleeding Kansas sounds very familiar.
They do talk about it, but I feel like they don't talk about it enough because it's a very important. I feel like how we got to the Civil War is 10 times more important than the actual Civil War itself.
I mean, the war itself is fighting.
Yes. It's very interesting. It's very exciting. But really how we got to the Civil War is incredibly important. I also think this goes very, very well hand in hand with last week's discussion about the filibusters in Nicaragua and Cuba. Kansas, at this point, if we're talking 1856, is still a territory. And up to that point, there had been, at this point, several crises that almost diverged into secession that were compromised on, the biggest being the Missouri Compromise that said that all territory north of the 30-degree line would be free and all south would be slave. It's a compromise, but it was one everyone agreed upon. It had been mandated for about 20 years at that point. Here comes Stephen Douglas, and he wants to build a railroad. He is an Illinois Democrat. He actually I forget if he beat, but he campaigned against Abraham Lincoln for the senatorship in Illinois. But this is before all that, he decides that he wants to organize the rest of the Louisiana Purchase in the North, but he realizes that he cannot do that because Southern senators, who had been dominating the country for most of the time at that point, would block any plans to organize the North Louisiana Purchase into more states because that would mean admitting more free states. And Stephen Douglas was like, all right, fine. If I need Southern support to organize that area into states, I will make an act that revises the Missouri Compromise. And at first, the first drafts of what's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act said that slavery will be left to popular vote. So territory residents will vote on whether or not they want to be a slave or free state. But that wasn't enough for the South. The Southern senators said, no, that's not enough. I still don't want the risk. So he took a major step, and he made a final draft that explicitly prohibited any ban on slavery north of the 30-degree parallel. And this caused an absolute fire in the Senate. And it's also worth noting that Stevie was a real estate investor and had personally increased the value of his properties in Chicago by helping create a railroad from there to Mobile, Alabama. And it's highly speculated that the reason why Stephen was so dead set on organizing the northern territory of the Louisiana Purchase was so that he could do the same thing by making a railroad across there to his properties in the Transcontinental Railroad to California. So that's important context. We have no direct evidence of that, but it's highly speculated. The reason why he was so dead set on making a transcontinental railroad and by doing it through the northern states was so that he could increase his own property value.
The facts are there. People can connect the dots.
Yeah. So they even blocked a 160-acre Homestead Act that would give basically give any settlers free 160 acres to make their home in the new territories because they thought that it would prompt northern settlers to go there. This caused a huge debate in the Senate. This was a complete violation. We always talk, people always talk about the Civil War as being the war of northern aggression has become the kind of accepted standpoint for a lot of people in this country, except this is a direct violation of Northern rights to not have slavery. Now they're being told that they have to have slavery there if people vote, even if they vote for it, that there's no explicit ban on it, which is insane. And William Seward, a senator, he gave this speech on May 25th, 1854, which is when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. Since there is no escaping your challenge, I accept it in behalf of the cause of freedom. We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give the victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right. Senator David Atchison of Missouri, he personally selected a lieutenant to be the lieutenant for Kansas Territory, and his lieutenant said, "Mark every scoundrel among you that is the least tainted with free soilism or abolitionism and exterminate him." Atchison, the governor of Missouri, he personally took it upon himself to lead hundreds and hundreds of bands of Missourians into Kansas to vote in elections and to also terrorize the local population. At this point, early in the Bleeding Kansas situation, Missourians still outnumber the northern settlers, but they're coming in high droves. Massachusetts and New England companies are all formed to personally fund Midwestern northern settlers to go to Kansas just to turn the tide of free soil versus pro-slavery settlers. And while at the early stage pro-slavery still has an edge, that they are well aware that the North is coming in droves, they cannot stop. Here's a quote from Atchison as he was personally leading. This is again the governor personally leading bands of these ruffians, they were called, into Kansas. He said, "There are 1,100 men coming over from Platte country to vote, and if that ain't enough, we can send 5,000, enough to kill every goddamned abolitionist in the territory."
Wow.
That is a direct quote. This is the governor. This is not an outlaw or anything. That is the governor of Missouri who said that.
And sometimes you look back and you think, wow. Debates used to be and debates in politics used to be so clean and civil.
I'll address that. It gets even worse. If we're talking, this is as much a story about the Senate as it is about Kansas. Northern Midwestern settlers, they ended up overcoming the Missourians, but at first, in the first election, Missouri still had the edge, and they elected a pro-slavery government, but a congressional committee found that more than 1,700 ballots were fraudulent. They elected a Pennsylvania Democrat, Governor Reeder, and he's pro-slavery, but he quickly becomes disillusioned with the competition going on between free soilers and pro-slavery people, and he orders new elections because the last were fraudulent, and free soilers win in a majority, but they just aren't seated. Like, they just don't let them on, even though they won.
That's cool.
And then Reeder goes off to talk to President Franklin Pierce, and he says this is not fair, and he is replaced. He's fired by Franklin Pierce. And they elect a new governor by the name of Shannon, and he comes in extremely pro-slavery, and he enacts a slave code that imposes a fine and imprisonment for speaking out against slavery and sanctioned the death penalty for those inciting slave riots or helping slave escapes. And, as a bonus, required no prior residence in Kansas to vote, basically allowing Missourians to come over in droves, vote, and then go home. And this is when, at this point, I believe the bushwhacking had already started, but free soilers start arming themselves like crazy.
Now, hold on. I'm going to go back to that really quick. So that he essentially denies all of free speech. And
yes, this is a huge violation of free speech.
Applies the death penalty. And, of course, I mean, like, you're about to get to what happens as a result of that. But, I mean, no one comes for this guy. And in government, in politics.
Well, the Northerns once did, but the North didn't have power of the Senate or the Congress.
They just didn't seat them.
And Franklin Pierce and his successor Buchanan were big pro-slavery people who got elected because of Southern support. So they couldn't go against us even if they wanted to.
What is with guys named Buchanan this episode?
That's a good point. So yeah, this is another reason why it's so laughable when you hear that the Civil War was a war about states' rights, that the South was seceding to protect their states' rights, whereas you see in the years leading up to the Civil War, they are violating the rights of other people and the rights, and I mean, let alone the slaves that they owned. They're violating their rights, sure, but they're also violating the rights of the settlers here to just say they don't like slavery. They're forcibly imposing their views on other people.
Very clear First Amendment rights.
And at this point, pro-slavery settlers are not the majority in Kansas. It's now free soilers have a very strong majority over them. Free soilers start arming themselves up against, because at this point there had been a war going on, not a war, but like a sort of proxy war of guerrilla bands of free soilers and pro-slavery people that would fight and literally shoot and kill each other over this issue. And they set up their own territorial government and constitution. So now there's two governments in Kansas. One free soil that was actually elected by the popular government, and one the quote-unquote official government that was not elected by popular sovereignty and is pro-slavery.
You know what amazes me by this? That amazes me about this is that long before the show, I've heard the term Northern aggression, and despite that, I have never heard this story about Bleeding Kansas.
And this is only, I mean, this is coming off the heels of last week where we were talking about the aggression of taking over Nicaragua by violence. Anyways, the murder of pro-slavery guerrilla bands murdered a free soiler, which ignited a standoff between 1,500 Missourians and 1,000 free soilers. And they stood up. They were fully armed. I believe the free soilers had a cannon with them as well.
So this is almost a mini.
This is a
Civil
mini
war.
But yeah, this is like the pregame for the actual Civil War. Atchison, the governor of Missouri, only called them off by telling them, "Hold off for a little bit. Now is not the time to strike." And the Missourians go home. But that doesn't really instoke a lot of confidence for the future peace in Kansas. In spring of 1856. Springtime means more settlers coming. So a pro-slavery judge starts panicking, and he starts sanctioning the formation of deputized posses to capture the Free State government for treason, even though they are the popularly elected government. With 5 cannons and 800 armed men, these are not soldiers, by the way. These are posses. These are just elected these are just Missourians with guns. They are organized with 5 cannons, and they lay siege to the abolitionist town of Lawrence, Kansas, firing those cannons away, destroying property, and they stormed the city. They demolished buildings. They burned down hotels, homes, shops, and newspaper offices.
Oh, my God.
The War of Northern Aggression, this is called, by the way. This is literal terrorism sanctioned by the government against a popular sovereignty. That is the definition of tyranny. And it doesn't get a whole lot of talk about that.
I didn't know Kansas even had a history.
This is where it gets even crazier. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a 2-day address to the Senate called The Crime Against Kansas. In it, he called Senator Andrew Butler a Don Quixote who had chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though polluted in the sight of the rest of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery.
Did you say Don Quixote?
I did not pronounce that right. Andrew's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, approached him 2 days later in the Senate. Your speech is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine. He beat Sumner over the head 30 times with his gold-tipped canes before it was finally wrenched from him. Charles Sumner...
Is that true?
Yes.
Oh, my God.
He was beaten in the Senate to a bloody pulp, and Charles Sumner survived miraculously, but he was never the same. He suffered from PTSD and permanent brain damage because of this.
Wow.
Brooks was not removed from office. He paid only a $300 fine, and he became a hero in the South. The Richmond Enquirer called the act good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequence. The vulgar abolitionists in the Senate are getting above themselves. They have grown saucy and dare to be impudent to gentlemen. The truth is they have been suffered to run too long without collars. They must be lashed into submission. I think they're using very clear terminology of how they treat their slaves there.
Yeah.
He then also received in the mail new canes inscribed with mottos like "Hit him again" and "Use knockdown arguments." And again, some now receive permanent brain damage from this, and nothing really came of it.
It was really gold tipped too. He just hit him in the head with a gold cane.
Over and over, 30 times.
Wow.
Back in Kansas, this is where we meet our friend John Brown, which you may have heard before. I mentioned him last week. John Brown was an Old Testament zealot. He was a Christian zealot, but of a very rare breed. Christianity started off as a revolutionary religion. It was very popular in urban areas with the urban poor because it espoused that the weak could be strong, that the weak should be treated right, that you should give amnesty, that you should take care of the poor. And as Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe, it became the status quo. And you don't see many people embody that true revolutionary spirit of Christianity, that it was something to uplift the poor and the weak. But you do see that in John Brown. He's an incredibly rare person. When he heard about the caning of Charles Sumner, he went crazy. And that's crazy. That's a direct quote from someone who was there. Someone said he went crazy. He said, "Something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights." John Brown mixed the passiveness of the teachings of the New Testament. John Brown mixed the teachings of the New Testament with the warrior spirit of the Old Testament. John,
forgive us for background noise.
Yeah, John, after the caning of Charles Sumner, he kidnapped 5 pro-slavery settlers near Pottawatomie, Kansas, and split open their skulls with broadswords.
Oh my God!
He was not messing around over the slavery business.
I see why it's called Bleeding Kansas now. This is like the most violent and
of course, the South went crazy over the massacre, it was called, but Northern people were like, you just laid siege to a whole town, and you just beat a senator to near death in this Congress, and now they're playing the victim again. They're like, oh my God, look at these abolitionist terrorists. Meanwhile, they're doing all of this and setting up a fraudulent government in the territory of Kansas. Governor Shannon, over all this controversy, he just resigns. He's like, I can't do this anymore. This is too much for me. They replaced him with a guy named John Geary, who was a war officer and the first mayor of San Francisco when that was still like a place of extreme crime and outlawry. He temporarily subdued all the guerrilla warfare going on, but he was also demanding that the draconian slave code we mentioned earlier be repealed, and it was just not. They just ignored him, and they put forth more legislators that pro-slavery sheriffs were in charge of voter registration. That's just pro-slavery cops are in charge of registering voters, so you know how that's going to go.
Exactly.
And also that pro-slavery commissioners were in charge of appointing judges, so that means they control voting and the legislature. And, this is the most damning one, that they would vote on a new territory constitution, but it would not go into effect with a referendum. A referendum is popular vote. That means that the territory government that was elected without popular vote was going to decide a constitution without the people actually voting on whether or not they agree with it. We're talking about violations of a social contract.
We'll have an election, but you're not allowed to vote.
Geary hated abolitionists, but this completely changed his mind on it. He was disgusted and vetoed the bill, but that made him the subject of daily death threats and public enemy number 1 to all Southerners across the country. He went to Pierce for help, and Pierce denied, and he resigned. This man was the strongest, most toughest. He hated abolitionists. He came in there a stark pro-slavery advocate, and Kansas proved to be too much for him. This guy was a veteran of war, and he couldn't handle the situation in Kansas. They hired a new governor by the name of Walker. He proposed a referendum. At this point, Buchanan's now in office. And Buchanan, unlike Pierce, agreed. He said, Buchanan was like, okay, yes, I am pro-slavery, but I am also in favor of a referendum for the Constitution. And Southern Democrats cried, "We are betrayed." This is a direct quote. "We are betrayed by an administration that went into power on Southern votes." And they had another election, and in Kansas. In the next election, investigations have found 2 remote districts with only 130 registers that had somehow cast 2,900 ballots. 1,600 names were copied onto voting rolls from an old Cincinnati city directory, and as a result, Walker threw out the results and approved a free soil majority for the next Congress. and Southerners, ironically, claimed that Walker tampered with the results. But this was the the current Congress that was still pro-slavery, in the meantime, passed a constitution with only referendum voting on slavery or no slavery, except the no slavery clause only prohibited importing new slaves, meaning any slaves in Kansas would be allowed to remain there, and also that's nearly impossible to enforce. It's just like 1858. If you want to bring a slave over the border, no one's going to stop you. Free Soilers flat out refused to participate in the election, and pro-slavery won. Kansas was then admitted as a slave state. Before I end off, that's not where Bleeding Kansas ends, but that's where it was admitted as a slave state. John Brown, our old friend, he went off to start a slave revolt. He marched down into Virginia.
Where are they now?
John Brown marched into Virginia with his own sons and a group of people with the intention of starting a slave revolt and then running away into the Appalachian Mountains to form a free slave society in the mountains, much like...
In the mountains. It sounds
He was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, actually, because in the mountains, guerrilla warfare is really easy. So that was his plan, was that if we take a bunch of slaves, run up into the mountains, form our own little government, and then we would have regular raids down the mountains to free more people and then grow their numbers. Unfortunately, it ended up being a doomed plan. He didn't get enough the support that he wanted, and also Harper's Ferry was kind of really hard to defend. He raided the federal armature works there, but at that point he realized that it was over. He let himself die, basically. It's very much accepted that John Brown knew this was going to lose and that he'd become stronger as a martyr. And when he was captured and brought before Congress, he said, "This court acknowledges too, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, which teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done."
Wow.
William Dean Howells said, "Brown has become an idea 1,000 times purer and better and loftier than the Republican idea." A Richmond newspaper said, "Thousands of men who a month ago scoffed at the idea of a dissolution of the Union now hold the opinion that its days are numbered." This is, again, that is a direct reference that Southerners were thinking of seceding because of slavery and because they couldn't stand people that wanted slavery to end. Governor Samuel Kirkwood of Iowa called Harper's Ferry an act of war, a greater crime than even the filibuster invaders of Cuba and Nicaragua were guilty of. Though, in the minds of many, Brown's raid was relieved to some extent of its guilt because the blow was struck for freedom and not for slavery. One last note, my last thing, I would like to talk about the rising abolitionist sentiment and just a further emphasis on what I mean by the War of Southern Aggression. And this is a brief note on the fugitive slave law, where fugitive slaves who escaped were hunted down and brought back to their masters. Anthony Burns was the man who escaped from slavery to Boston, and he wrote a letter home to his brother, but it was intercepted by his master. His owner traveled to Boston, and Burns was detained in the federal courthouse. A vigilance committee led by Unitary clergyman Thomas Higginson resolved that resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. A group of abolitionists, a mixed-race group of abolitionists, stormed the courthouse with axes, revolvers, and a battering ram, but were beaten back by Boston deputies, and the Pierce administration deployed the Marines to disperse the mob. This is a direct quote.
The Marines. Wow.
This is a direct quote from the book Battle Cry of Freedom, which is where I got all of this information from. On June 2nd, the troops marched Burns to the wharf through streets lined with sullen Yankees standing in front of buildings draped in black with the American flag hanging upside down and church bells tolling a dirge to liberty in the cradle of the American Revolution. One Boston was witness to all of this, who was up to this point a conservative who was kind of pro-slavery. He said, "When it was all over and I was left alone in my office, I put my face in my hands and wept. I could do nothing less." Someone else said, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and woke up stark, mad abolitionists." And that is what I mean when I say the war of Southern aggression, that they are increasingly coming into northern borders, they are kidnapping people, they are causing many civil wars in Kansas and violating rights, and yet still to this day, the Civil War is known as the War of Northern Aggression. And again, all of that comes from The Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson.
I've heard really great things about that book.
It's kind of the go-to book on the Civil War if you want it not in multiple volumes. If you just want one book on the Civil War, it's pretty good.
And that is such a lot to condense, even though...
It was a little rushed towards the end, but I wanted to get everything in there.
We've gone back to the Civil War a lot, but that is still so much information about just one specific thing.
I really wanted to... I know it seemed kind of out of, like, continuity with the rest of the story, but I really wanted to squeeze the story of Anthony Burns in there because the thought of him being marched down the streets with people, citizens of Boston, lining up, just watching him, knowing they tried to save him, they tried to storm the courthouse, but it didn't work, and he was... Despite the will of the people.
I know why you wanted to include that.
No, being from Boston was secondary. That is just...
it is a very powerful sentiment.
Story about... and people forget, of course, the North is far from a perfect place of racial equality.
Yes.
But it does go to show why the North became so pro-abolitionist, because there was a real rise of abolition. Not everyone, but there was a rise of abolitionism spirit in the North.
And I imagine
and why they were ready to go to war for this.
Like that one testimony that, they went to bed, just so-and-so and woke up stark abolitionists. Like, I can understand that based on what I'm hearing.
And that's why when people say that the Civil War wasn't over slavery, it's so laughable when you read these quotes and you see everything happening up to the Civil War, and it's all slavery.
I mean, it makes sense. I don't think anyone really knows what Bleeding Kansas is by name. That's why we do this show.
And it's all slavery. I mean, when they talk about states' rights, they're talking about their rights to slaves and their rights to kidnap slaves in non-slave states. But yeah, I think I went right up to our deadline there. That was a long one.
That was a long one, but we want to thank you for listening to History Repeating. This was a very fun episode to do. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we will be back next week at 1 p.m.
And it won't be about the Civil War.
Final show.
And it won't be about the Civil War, I promise.
That's okay. I enjoy the Civil War. If you missed any other previous episodes, you can catch them on our YouTube channel, Hawk TV, HC Hawk TV. We have all the previous episodes there, and all our future episodes will be up there too. We want to thank you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.